Okay, so as I said, let's get started with the first part. Why do we need to change? Why do we actually need to communicate? Why do we collaborate? So organizations, they collaborate for various reasons, but most of all, collaboration and thus communication ensures that we pool together our talents, strengths, and ideas. For example, now I'm teaching this class and I can focus on the content because I'm collaborating with people who have an expertise in audiovisual support and IT support. It also increases learning. When you put different people together, they will learn from each other. You can transfer skills. And of course, there is efficiency because you can specialize, you can support, you can help each other. And humans are social creatures. The fact that we are collaborating, that you have a role to play in a team, enhances your job satisfaction. So that's why these are 4 examples of why collaboration is important. There are many more, but these are some key aspects that especially play a role now that we don't work together, especially if you look at enhanced job satisfaction. So how do we collaborate? Well, traditionally it was fairly easy for small teams and small organizations to meet physically, to work in the same place, and that was usually easy. You set a time, you set a place. Larger companies, international organizations, larger institutes were already working remotely a lot, and they're using different channels for communication and collaboration. However, today that has changed. Now every organization is more connected with other organizations. We're doing outsourcing, we're doing remote collaboration, we're hiring expertise. We have suppliers, we have vendors, we have customers all over the globe. So this globalization, this networked approach, means that we are more and more connected. And our work-life balance has shifted, and in the last days it has shifted dramatically, which means that we were already slowly moving towards different concepts of working. You could work at home, you could work remotely, you could work in the evening, you could work in the morning, and so on. So the work-life balance and the options you have to choose to work when and where you want were already increasing, and now there has been this tremendous push for it in the last days. So what happens when you work remotely together? It is actually formation of a virtual team. So virtual teams are made of people that work in different places, work in different times. And they face certain challenges when you communicate. So those challenges, for example, is that you might be awake at different times. If you work around the globe, you might not be in the physical same room. And technologies can help to reduce those barriers and allow teams, virtual teams, to work together. So you can actually say that what are these challenges? Well, one of these challenges is the distance. So as you can see in the slide, you can either work in the same place or you can work in a different place. And another axis that you could perceive would be the time. So you work at the same time or you work at a different time. So that's whether you work synchronous or not. So if you map out these 4 quadrants, we would say, well, you can work synchronous in person, you could work remotely at the same time, you could work at different times but in the same place, or you can work at different times in different places. And there's all kinds of interactions that you could map out. So I'll give you an example. So here on the left side of the screen you will see a couple of interactions and technologies. And I'll give you a minute to think about where you would place them. So which of these are, for example, real-time, in-person, which of these are remotely real-time, which are not real-time and remotely? Okay, well, since we put it online, you can pause it later if you want more time to think about it. But this is how I would map them. Of course, you can argue for different ways of doing this. But for example, in in-person meeting, we do it at the same place at the same time. But if we use a pinboard, for example, and I leave a message in the pantry for my colleagues to do their dishes, it's at the same place, but at different times. I might put that message up in the morning, and they might read it in the afternoon. So on the remote, there's a lot of options you might recognize. Real-time remote, phone calls. But if you work at different times and different places, you use email, for example, so people will read it somewhere else at a different time than when you send it. And I'll give you one more to challenge, would be, put it at the bottom left, is a lecture. So if I would ask you where in this quadrant you could put a lecture. Okay, so it's a bit of a trick question because you could actually place them in all four. You could have a lecture in person in the classroom, which these days is a bit tricky. You could do a lecture, you could follow it remotely, real time. So for the people who are watching now, welcome. So you're the synchronous remote option. People who watch this later at their own PC are asynchronous remote. And for those of you who are watching this at the university at some later stage, you know, those rare exceptions would be same place, asynchronous. So these are a lot of like communications options, and just we tend to think a lot about communication as in real-time communication, phone calls, messages, and so on. But those are not the only options. A lot of companies, organizations use intranets and employee portals. So they allow people to access information at their convenience in a structured way. So these intranets, employee portals now play a more important role, where before you could walk to a secretary or a support team, or you could ask somebody, you might not now need to rely more on these intranets and these portals. So it is really important that these are being updated and that they give the answers that the people are looking for to reduce unnecessary communication. So a lot of these portals, they will include intranet. You could use Yammer, for example, from Microsoft, or SharePoint, where people could upload documents, could ask questions, could provide updates or links to other systems. And a lot of self-service. So for example, this is a snapshot, albeit a bit of an older version, of the Tilburg University intranet. And what is interesting is that these intranets can be tailored. So for us as a staff member, we will see different options than when a student logs in, because we have different information needs. So that allows us to find the information that we're looking for a lot faster. So that's really asynchronous remote information retrieval and sending. Of course, now, in these days, there's, and I'm sure you all recognize, there's been a rapid increase in the video conferencing, which is synchronous but remotely. And there's different options for that. There is extensive dedicated video conferencing systems that are really installed in a room with a lot of equipment and support. They're usually more expensive. But today, since technology has become cheaper, more accessible, connections have become better, there's also the option to do video conferencing at your desktop, at home, from your phone. So video conferencing is a great solution, and it allows people to talk to each other while being in different locations. But there's also some challenges. And I'll talk a bit more about these challenges, because some of you may encounter them. When you do video conferencing, initially you would think that, oh, this is great, we can talk to each other as we would do in real life. However, we know that when people communicate via laptops and digital devices, some dynamics change. So when you organize online calls, it's really important you control the meeting, because you're lacking verbal cues of when people want to interrupt. There's also the moderation and decision making, and usually it's good to separate the two in terms of content and who's controlling the content and who's controlling the flow of the meeting. And another criticism often in working in virtual teams or remotely is that there's a lack of follow-up. You know, the meeting is over, you hang up, there's no chat after the meeting about the next action, so a lack of follow-up is often a problem. There's also technical challenges. There's equipment that has to work. You saw the surge in webcams that are being bought. There is a compatibility that you have to take into account. And there are the users you have to think about. Not everybody in your organization might be as able, tech savvy, have the equipment, have the time and capacity to set up and join remote meetings, or might be familiar with it. And part of that is digital literate and digital divide, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the lecture. But the communication itself is also really a challenge, because you might have cultural barriers that are less apparent when you're working remotely. People may have different styles of conducting meetings. You are more looking at a screen than a person really in the face, especially if you're not using webcams. You don't have non-verbal communication, so it's hard to pick up on cues when somebody wants to speak up, when somebody tends to disagree but is a bit quieter. And of course there is the attention that people might wander when they're looking at a screen, and there might be distractions around them, especially if you're working at home and have kids these days. So you might remember that video or the conference call from the BBC, the expert on BBC who gave an interview while his kids came crashing into the room. And I'm sure many of you can relate to his experience now. I'll also put a link there to a great YouTube video called A Conference Call in Real Life, where they they replay what it would be if all the mistakes that happen in a conference call would happen in a real meeting. For example, people putting push out of the room, making coffee, not muting, or forgetting to unmute, and so on. So just to give you some tips that I've used in the last days communicating online, and some experience I had working with international humanitarian and government agencies where we do a lot of these calls. First of all, organize. So prepare as you would for a real meeting, perhaps even more. Tend to separate what you want to talk about from moderating the call. So it is good that somebody thinks about what we want to achieve and somebody else is moderating who's speaking and giving the words. So ensure that your meetings have a reason, that you know that everybody who joins the meeting knows what they're going to do. Think about an alternative and a backup. In case the call fails, people can't join, there is a technical hiccup, be ready to have an alternative. The alternative doesn't have to be an alternative technology. The alternative could also be we'll cancel the meeting. But you want to think about what happens if we can't do this call. Is it a bad thing? Can we postpone it? Do we need to do a phone call with everyone? And so on. So thinking about that ahead of time gives you more peace of mind going into the call, and you have a plan for when something goes wrong. And most of all, conference calls are things that you have to practice. As more as you do them, the more you become familiar with it. So, and then for the communication, try to build a rapport. There is, as we do more and more online communication and video conferencing, we tend to lose the connection with people because we have efficient meetings, we're talking about them. Try to find alternative ways. I saw people organize dance parties, drinking coffee virtually, and so on. So try to not only make it about work, because you will lose the personal connection. And remember, we talked in the beginning about how important collaboration is for the job satisfaction. And in large calls, you can take some lessons from radio communication. They have specific protocols. And my number one tip would be think about muting and unmuting. So if you're not speaking, mute, unmute. When you want to speak, think before you speak. And use the chat option. It's great for quick comments, numbers, confirmation, links, and so on. Okay. Enough about the practical tips. What does that mean that we have all these tools available now? That means that people can work anywhere we want. Well, I mean, our options are a bit limited these days, but essentially you could work anywhere around the world, anytime you want. And that has sparked what we call digital nomads, people who don't have a fixed workplace, people who work whenever, wherever they want, and they'll take the laptop and they connect. And you will see, if you Google digital nomads, you will see a lot of people, especially in Starbucks and coffee places, moving around with their equipment. I'll give you one example of myself. I do a lot of work in humanitarian crisis management and information management. So when I go on training or I go on a mission, I also tend to be a digital nomad. So half of my stuff and my equipment is packed with IT equipment, but that allows me to set up a nice office with all facilities I need anywhere I arrive. So essentially, we're all becoming digital nomads now, be it at home or elsewhere.